It was supposed to be a typical Sunday dinner. The kind of dinner I had spent countless hours preparing in the past. Carefully chosen dishes, meticulously set table, and the endless charades of smiling and nodding while holding my breath under the weight of expectations. But it wasn't a typical Sunday, not anymore. In the span of just 5 minutes, everything that I had endured, all the years of restraint, submission, and silence, would come to an explosive end. David slapped me. His hand, the one I had once trusted, the one I thought I knew, crashed against my cheek with a sound that echoed through the quiet dining room. The shock didn't come from the slap itself, it was the moment before. The way he had looked at me as he lifted his hand. That chilling certainty in his eyes that I had crossed some invisible line. As if his right to dominate, to control, had been finally challenged in a way he could not allow. The slap was nothing compared to the smirk that followed. "You know your place," he said, his voice dripping with that familiar arrogance. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry, didn't break down in front of his family, the way they expected me to. No, what broke that night wasn't my skin. It wasn't the sting on my face. What shattered was the illusion, the delicate facade of our marriage, the fragile mirage of the perfect couple. In those few moments, I saw the truth. I saw it reflected in the faces of his parents and his sister. The truth that I had been living a lie, playing a role that had been written for me long before I even understood who I truly was. 5 minutes. That's all it took to unmask the man I had been living with for years. 5 minutes to tear away the layers of denial and deception, the endless gaslighting, the manipulation, the years of silence and submission, all of it folded up neatly into that suitcase I had packed earlier that morning, waiting for this very moment. I remember the sound of his palm against my cheek like it was yesterday, reverberating in the room, in my mind, in my soul. But it wasn't the slap that stung the most. No, it was his smugness, the smirk on his face, like he had won, like he had put me back in my place. It was the look in his eyes that told me, without a doubt, that he thought he had finally broken me. He was wrong. In that fleeting moment of utter humiliation, something inside me snapped. The years of being small, being silent, being nothing more than an accessory to his life, evaporated. The world around me, the family I had once tried so desperately to please, suddenly seemed so distant. I saw them for what they were, accomplices in a system that had allowed his behavior to continue unchecked for far too long. And I realized something I had never fully acknowledged before. I had a choice, and I would make it. I looked at David, standing there with his smug expression, his parents stiff and uncomfortable at the table, and his sister avoiding my gaze. 5 minutes. That's all it took for me to make the decision that would change everything. "Go ahead, David," I said, my voice steady and calm, though inside, I felt an adrenaline rush like I had never known. "You are the man of this house, and it's time you remember your place." I stood up slowly, my hand still holding the napkin I had barely touched. The clink of the cutlery on the table was the only sound in the room as I walked away from the family dinner. I could feel their eyes following me. I could feel the uncertainty and confusion swirling around the room, but I didn't stop. This moment wasn't about them. This moment was about me. I walked toward the hallway closet where I had hidden the suitcase. It wasn't just a suitcase, though. It was my life, neatly packed into a small, manageable container, ready to be carried away. My heart pounded in my chest as I pulled it out, rolling it toward David's feet. His eyes widened, his smirk faltering for the first time in years. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice rising in panic. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I reached into my purse and pulled out an envelope, the weight of it seeming to carry the weight of years of planning, years of carefully keeping track of everything. As I placed it on the table, I looked up at his father, Richard, who had started to rise in defense of his son. But I held my ground, my gaze locking onto his with a quiet defiance that I had never allowed myself to show before. "You might want to stay seated for this part, Richard," I said, my voice sharp, unwavering. "It concerns you too." The silence that followed was thick with tension, suffocating. And then I began, my words flowing with a clarity and purpose that felt almost foreign to me. but also incredibly right. I would not be their pawn anymore. Not today. Not ever again. The dinner table was set with precision, each plate arranged just so, like a picture from an old family album. The fine china that gleamed under the dim light was a symbol of years gone by, the years when David's mother, Eleanor, had curated the ideal household. A silent, unwavering pillar of the traditional values she had lived by. Her hands trembled ever so slightly as she arranged the dishes, the same hands that had once nurtured a marriage built on submission and control, yet now trembled with the weight of decades of suppressed desires. It was almost poetic, the irony of it all. David stood tall at the head of the table, his chest puffed out like a peacock, displaying the same arrogance that had been ingrained in him for years. His gaze swept across the table, and for a fleeting second, I saw the reflection of his father's approval in the way Richard nodded from the other side. It was subtle, but I knew that nod too well, the silent acknowledgement that David was following in his footsteps, doing what men in their world did best. Asserting dominance, maintaining control. Their quiet, mutual respect was the unspoken law in their house. David's sister, Caroline, shifted in her seat. She had been quiet, like always trying to avoid making waves. Her eyes were fixed on her plate, her posture tense but carefully controlled. She had never fully broken away from the family's way of thinking. But today, she too would feel the tremors that were about to shake everything to its core. The rest of us at the table had all played our parts in the charade. The dutiful wife, the proud father, the compliant daughter. But it was becoming too much. So, Megan, David's voice cut through the air, smooth as silk, yet laced with that familiar venom. Do you still believe that the man of the house should be respected? You know your place. The words hung in the air like an accusation, but I had heard them before, countless times. His voice carried that tone of superiority, the one that had slowly poisoned our marriage over the years, the one that had pushed me to the edge, making me feel small, like I was invisible in my own life, caught in a web of expectations and silent commands. Before I respond, let me ask you this, my incredible viewers. Have you ever been in a situation where someone tried to dictate your worth, your voice, your place? Drop a comment below and share your story. And if you've ever fought for your place at the table, hit that like button. It means more than you know. The sting of his words should have hurt. It should have made me shrink back in my seat, bow my head in submission. But it didn't. Something inside me had changed. I had been playing a role for too long. It was time to stop pretending, to stop hiding behind the polite smiles and the perfect answers. It was time to show them what was beneath the surface, beneath the mask I had worn for years. The table, once a place of comfort, now felt like a battlefield. David's parents looked between us, waiting for the inevitable reaction. The silence that followed David's statement was deafening. Eleanor, who had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of silence, stared down at her plate. Richard's hand tightened around his glass, but he didn't speak. It was as if they were all waiting for me to fall in line, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness as they had always expected. But I wasn't about to beg. I stood up slowly, the air around me thick with their unspoken judgments. My heart pounded in my chest as I placed my napkin on the table. The sound of it, so small, seemed to echo in the space between us. Every eye in the room followed my movements, the family frozen in their own discomfort. The years of suppressed rage and pain surged within me, threatening to burst free. But I didn't scream. I didn't lash out. I simply walked to the hallway closet, where I had hidden the suitcase I had packed earlier that morning. The act itself was simple, but it was the culmination of everything I had endured. The years of his belittling, the control, the manipulation. I pulled out the suitcase, rolling it slowly toward David's feet, the wheels almost silent on the polished floor. His smirk faltered as he looked down, confusion flickering in his eyes. For a moment he didn't understand. But I didn't stop. I knew exactly what I was doing. You don't need this house, I said, my voice steady, calm, the adrenaline coursing through my veins. It's yours, David. You're the man of this house. Take it. Take it all. The murmurs around the table grew louder as I stood tall in front of him, watching his face shift from confusion to panic. The pride that had once filled his chest deflated. He stumbled for words, his control slipping through his fingers. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Showing you exactly what the man of the house has earned," I replied, my gaze unwavering. I gestured to the suitcase. "Inside, you'll find your clothes, your toiletries, and some interesting documents I've been collecting." His father's hand shot up, as if to stop me, but I held up a finger, signaling him to remain silent. "Richard, you might want to stay seated for this part. It concerns you too," I added, my voice colder than I ever thought I could sound. The room was silent, save for the soft rustling of the envelope I placed on the table. I could feel the weight of their stares, the disbelief, the growing horror at what I was about to reveal. But I wasn't finished yet. "I've been documenting everything," I continued, my tone steady, each word clear and deliberate. "The transactions, the manipulations. I have everything. And tomorrow, I'll be sending it to the relevant authorities." I watched as their faces drained of color, the reality of what I had just said sinking in. James's smugness was gone, replaced with uncertainty. Eleanor's hands trembled as she reached for her water glass, her eyes wide, finally realizing that the little games they had played for years were over. Caroline's expression shifted from discomfort to something else. Was it admiration? Fear? Both? It didn't matter now. The walls had come down. And that, my friends, was just the beginning. The game had changed, and I wasn't playing by their rules anymore. I had always known that this day would come. I just never imagined it would unfold like this. During a family dinner, no less. There were so many signs leading up to this moment, each one a piece of a puzzle I had been carefully assembling for years. Looking back, I could see it all now, laid out before me like a map, each small act of control, every comment, every slight, every little manipulation that had chipped away at me. But it wasn't just the physical abuse or the emotional scars. It was the way he had molded me, turned me into someone I wasn't. And all the while I had played along, quietly calculating. The first years had been filled with the sweetness of discovery, the joy of building a life together. At least that's what I thought. But slowly, so slowly that I didn't even notice at first, David began to shift. His charm, his easy smile, the way he seemed to care so deeply about me, started to fade. What I once saw as his passion for success morphed into something darker, a need to control. And I let him. At first, I thought it was just a phase, that maybe I was being too sensitive, too reactive. But then it became clear it wasn't a phase. It was his nature. His need to assert power wasn't about me, it was about him. It began with the small things. Comment here, a suggestion there. "Maybe you should let me handle that," he'd say, as if I wasn't capable of making decisions for myself. He started making financial decisions without consulting me. For our future, of course. He'd insist on keeping the bank accounts in his name, though we both contributed. And when I questioned it, when I tried to suggest that we should make joint decisions, he'd laugh it off, telling me that he had everything under control. "Trust me, Meg. I know what's best," he'd say, his voice smooth, reassuring. And I did trust him. I trusted him for years. But what I didn't see at the time, what I refused to see, was that he wasn't just controlling the money, he was controlling me. The gaslighting became more frequent. Little by little, he made me doubt myself, my choices, my thoughts. He'd twist words, tell me I was overreacting, that I was being irrational. And I believed him. I thought I was the problem. Maybe I was too sensitive, too demanding. But no. Looking back now, it was never me. It was him. His words, his actions, his constant need to assert dominance in every aspect of our life together. It was all part of the plan. I began to bury my own desires, my own thoughts, because his always seemed to matter more. I stopped making decisions. I stopped speaking up. I let him make all the calls, not just with money, but with our time, with our friends, with our future. I became nothing more than an extension of him, a passive participant in my own life. But I didn't see it. Not until it was too late. It wasn't until the isolation set in that I realized how much I had lost. I had friends once. Women who made me feel like I could be more, like I could stand on my own 2 feet and be proud of who I was. But one by one, they faded. David didn't like them. He'd tell me they were too independent, too wild for me. And I believed him. I let him convince me that the only place I belonged was by his side. In our home, quiet and still. I didn't need anyone else, he said. He was enough for me. And I believed him. Years went by, each one blending into the next, each day a little more suffocating than the last. But I never let on. I played my role perfectly. The perfect wife. The perfect homemaker. The perfect partner. I smiled when I was supposed to smile, laughed when it was expected of me, and bit my tongue when I wanted to scream. I kept everything inside, carefully hidden, tucked away, until the day came when I would no longer be able to hold it all in. And all the while I was making plans. Small plans, secret plans. At first, it was just a thought. A tiny seed planted in the back of my mind, like a distant dream I couldn't quite reach. But as the years went on, that seed began to grow. I started documenting everything. His comments, his financial decisions, the subtle ways he undermined me. I kept notes, made spreadsheets, took pictures, and saved receipts. I knew it wasn't enough just to escape. I had to make sure I could leave with the strength to stand up to him. I had to make sure that when I finally made my move, it would be undeniable. I opened a separate bank account, one he didn't know about. Every paycheck, every bonus, I quietly diverted half of it into that account. I was careful, so careful, never leaving a trace. I rented an apartment, not just for the sake of having a place to go, but to have a home, a safe space, a refuge where I could finally breathe without him watching my every move. And when I had the chance, I took it. I began applying for jobs, ones that would give me the freedom I so desperately needed, the financial independence that would allow me to stand on my own 2 feet. But I couldn't do it yet. I couldn't leave. Not until I was sure. David's control wasn't just physical or financial. It was emotional, psychological. I had spent 5 years learning how to be the perfect wife. How to smile when he spoke, how to laugh at his jokes, how to pretend like everything was fine when it wasn't. I had spent 5 years building my escape route, one brick at a time, while playing the part he wanted me to play. I became his perfect vision of a wife, the woman who didn't question, the woman who didn't push back. And all the while I was waiting for the right moment, the right excuse to break free. 5 years. It took 5 years of calculated submission, 5 years of silence, 5 years of pretending that everything was okay. But in those 5 years, I learned everything I needed to know. I learned how to play the part. I learned how to pretend. But more importantly, I learned how to plan. And when the moment came, when he slapped me in front of his family, everything I had worked for, everything I had secretly planned, finally fell into place. This wasn't just about escaping him. It was about reclaiming myself, about finding the strength to fight back after years of being controlled. And I was ready to show him that the woman he thought he had broken wasn't broken at all. She was just waiting for the right moment to rise. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut through with a knife. David stood there, still frozen in disbelief as I wheeled the suitcase to his feet, the wheels echoing softly against the polished hardwood floor. His smug expression faltered, and for the first time in years, I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross his face. It wasn't the confusion of someone who didn't understand what was happening. It was the realization that I was no longer the woman he could control. The air grew heavy with silence as the family watched, waiting for the inevitable. It felt as though time had slowed to a crawl, each second stretching out like an eternity. I could feel their eyes on me, heavy with judgment, discomfort, and disbelief. I wasn't just confronting David. I was confronting an entire legacy, his family's legacy, the unspoken rules of their world, the expectations that had been passed down through generations, the assumption that I would always bow to their authority. Everything was crumbling, and in its place I was standing taller than I ever had before. David's face shifted from confusion to anger. His eyes darkened, the familiar fire of control flaring to life as he took a step toward me. He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come immediately. I could see the panic behind his eyes, the desperation to regain control, to make me back down, to make me feel small again. But I wasn't going to back down. Not this time. What the hell do you think you're doing? He demanded, his voice rising with each word. His hand clenched at his side, the muscles in his jaw tightening as he struggled to maintain composure. The man who had once seemed so untouchable now appeared smaller, vulnerable even. I wasn't sure if it was the shock of my defiance or the sting of my revelations. Maybe both, but I could see it now. The walls he had so carefully built around himself were starting to crumble, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. I remained calm, unwavering. My pulse didn't quicken, my hands didn't tremble. Instead, I stepped back, slowly, deliberately, placing the envelope on the table in front of him. My eyes met his, steady, focused, as I spoke in a tone so cold, so matter-of-fact. It felt like a dagger cutting through the air between us. I'm showing you exactly what the man of the house has earned, I said, my voice clear and controlled. Everything you've done, every lie you've told, every penny you've stolen, it's all here. I paused for a moment, allowing the weight of my words to settle in, the silence thickening like a fog around us. The family was still frozen, unsure of how to react. Their eyes flickered between me and David, unsure of how to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the woman who stood before them now. David's eyes narrowed, but there was no longer any confidence in them. There was only fear. He stepped forward, as if to snatch the envelope from the table, but I held my ground, meeting him with a look that dared him to come closer. His hand hovered for a moment, then fell back to his side. He was no longer the man who called the shots, the man who thought he could control me. The mask he had worn for years, the perfect image of the dominating husband, was slipping, and for once, I wasn't afraid to see what lay beneath. "What do you think this is going to do?" he asked, his voice trembling just slightly. "You can't prove anything. You're wasting your time." I took a deep breath, savoring the feeling of control that was slowly creeping over me. "Actually, I can," I said, my voice calm, steady. "I've been building my case for the last 3 years, David. Every transaction, every lie, every moment of manipulation is documented. And I have the evidence to prove it. The IRS is going to love this little project of yours." The color drained from his face. I watched as the smirk that had so often graced his lips vanished, replaced by a grimace of disbelief. His eyes darted to his father, Richard, who had been silent throughout the entire exchange. But now Richard's face had gone pale, his eyes wide with panic. He had to know what was coming, what I was about to expose. And I wasn't finished yet. "You're right, David," I continued, my voice unwavering. "You are the man of the house. But what you've built here, the lies, the manipulation, the abuse, it's all coming down. And you have until tomorrow evening to pack up the rest of your things and leave. After that, I'll be changing the locks, and I'll be sending everything I have to the authorities. Unless you want to make this even harder for yourself. That's your choice." The silence was deafening. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked between us, his gaze shifting to his wife, Eleanor, who was staring at her hands, her face ashen. Caroline, David's sister, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She looked at me, then at her brother, then back to me, her face a mixture of disbelief and something else. Regret, maybe? I wasn't sure. It didn't matter. The game had changed. I turned to leave, but then Eleanor's voice, barely a whisper, stopped me in my tracks. "Sarah," she said, her voice trembling. "Where will he go?" I paused, taking a moment to savor the full weight of her words. It was as if, for the first time, she was seeing me as I truly was, not the submissive daughter-in-law, not the compliant wife, but someone who had finally found her strength, someone who had fought back. "Maybe he can stay with the man he learned everything from," I replied, my words dripping with irony. "After all, isn't that what family's for?" The words hung in the air between us, heavy with the truth I had just uncovered. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't need to. As I walked toward the door, I could hear the sound of Eleanor's soft sobs, and I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The family I had spent so many years trying to please, to appease, had finally seen the cracks in their perfect facade. The illusion was shattered, and they were no longer in control. As I stepped outside, the weight of the moment finally hit me. It wasn't just about getting away from David. It was about reclaiming everything I had lost. My dignity, my power, my sense of self. I had done it. I had broken free, and there was no going back. The room remained frozen in that thick silence, as though time itself had momentarily paused to witness the unraveling of everything they had held dear. My heart was beating fast, but my body was calm, steady, as I prepared to lay bare the truth they had so long buried beneath layers of lies and deception. It wasn't just the slap that had broken me. It was everything leading up to that moment. Every controlling comment, every decision made behind my back, every subtle manipulation that had chipped away at me. Each one a piece of the puzzle I had been quietly piecing together for years. And now it was time to expose it all. I looked down at the envelope in front of me, feeling its weight. It was more than just a collection of documents. It was my liberation. With one swift motion, I opened it, pulling out the meticulously organized stack of papers that had been gathering dust in my drawer for months. The very documents that would undo David's carefully constructed world of deceit. I felt a rush of power surge through me as I laid them out before him, one by one. The first was a spreadsheet, a detailed list of every joint account transaction over the last 2 years, with each entry marked and highlighted in bold red. It was a careful record of every dollar he had moved into his private accounts after my quarterly bonuses were deposited. "Here," I said, my voice cool but strong. "This is the pattern, David. Every time I earned something, you siphoned it away into your private account. After every single bonus, every extra penny I made was used to fill your pockets, while I stayed silent, pretending not to notice. But I noticed, David. I noticed everything." I let the words hang in the air for a moment, letting them settle into the heavy silence that surrounded us. David's face had gone ashen. I could see the panic in his eyes as he glanced down at the pages in front of him, then back up at me, his mouth opening and closing as if he was searching for words that wouldn't come. He couldn't speak. There was nothing he could say that would change what I had just revealed. But I wasn't done yet. Next, I pulled out a set of legal documents, contracts, emails, and invoices, proof of the illegal dealings between David and his father, Richard. The consulting fees that had been funneled to Richard's so-called business, creative tax evasion, a company that had long been defunct, yet somehow still managed to receive payments from various clients. I had found it all during my late-night research, painstakingly sorting through old tax returns, following the money trail until it led me to them. I had watched David and Richard operate in the shadows for far too long. They had assumed I was too naive, too compliant to ever question what they were doing. But now I had everything, and I was ready to bring it into the light. "Let's talk about this, David," I said, my voice lower now, but no less forceful. "These payments, these consulting fees, they were paid to your father's company, which, as you know, ceased operations years ago. Funny how these payments kept coming in right after my bonuses were deposited. It's almost like you were siphoning off my earnings and laundering the money through your family business." David's face was completely drained of color now, his eyes flickering from the papers to his father, who had remained quiet through all of this, his hands shaking slightly as they gripped the edge of the table. I could see the realization dawning on Richard's face, the weight of his own involvement in the scheme suddenly becoming clear. This was no longer just about David, it was about his entire family, the empire they had built on lies and deceit. I turned to Richard, meeting his eyes directly. "You knew, didn't you? You knew all along what David was doing, what he had been hiding. And now all of it is going to come out." The silence between us was deafening. Richard opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. His eyes flickered toward David, and then back at me, his face a mask of fear and disbelief. He had never imagined I would do this. He had never imagined I would find the strength to pull back the curtain on their carefully curated facade. But I wasn't finished yet. I pulled out the final piece of evidence, the most damning of all, the audio recordings. Over the years, as David became more aggressive, more condescending, I had started recording our conversations. Late-night arguments, casual remarks made when he thought I wasn't paying attention, moments when he let his mask slip and revealed the full extent of his arrogance. The recordings were brutal, painful to listen to, but they were my insurance, my protection, and now they would be the nail in his coffin. I clicked play. "You're just like your mother, Sarah." David's voice echoed through the room from the speaker. "Weak, complaining, always trying to make everything about yourself. I'm the man of this house, and I decide what's best for us, not you. You're lucky I even let you have any say in things. You should be grateful I'm even giving you a chance to voice your opinions." The words hung in the air like poison, sharp and cutting. His voice, so cold, so dismissive, echoed in the silence of the room, the tone of entitlement and cruelty unmistakable. "I'm not going to let you get away with this," I said as the recording played on. "I've kept everything, all the lies, all the abuse, all the manipulation, and now it's all going to come out. The authorities will see it all, David. They'll hear you for who you really are." I watched as David's face turned a sickly shade of green, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He had always thought he could control me, that he could make me small, make me invisible. But what he hadn't counted on was my ability to see through the mask, to gather the pieces, to fight back when the time came. 5 years, I whispered, more to myself than to him. 5 years of living in the shadows of your lies. But not anymore. I'm done being your pawn. David's hands trembled as he reached for the envelope, but he didn't touch it. He knew better. He couldn't. There was no denying the truth now. I had everything, and it was going to take more than his apologies, more than his threats to undo the damage he had done. I turned to leave, but not before I dropped one last piece of information into the mix. "I've already spoken to my lawyer. I've already made arrangements. This is happening, David. You've lost." I turned on my heel and walked out, leaving the family to stew in their own guilt and lies. It was over, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight of the chains I had worn for so long lift off my shoulders. I had finally freed myself, and there was no going back. As I stepped out of the house and into the cool night air, I could feel the weight of everything I had just done settling over me, like a heavy cloak. The adrenaline that had surged through me moments ago began to ebb, leaving behind an unexpected calm. I had said the words. I had exposed the truth. And now there was nothing left to do but wait for the fallout. The family I had spent years trying to appease, trying to belong to, was shattered. And in that moment, as I walked down the driveway, I realized that the person I had once been, the submissive wife, the dutiful daughter-in-law, was gone. She had been replaced by someone who was stronger, more determined, more free than I had ever imagined possible. But freedom wasn't without its consequences. I hadn't even made it to my car when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't have to look to know who it was. It was Caroline, David's sister, who had been so uncomfortable at dinner, who had tried to shrink into the background while her brother's temper flared. She was probably the last person I expected to reach out. But there it was, the small vibration in my hand that signaled her first message. "Are you okay?" The text read simple, and yet it carried so much more. It wasn't a question about my well-being. It wasn't concern for my health. No, it was the opening of a door, an invitation into a conversation that had been impossible to have before. The truth that had been suppressed for so long was now out in the open, and Caroline, for the first time in a long time, was forced to confront the reality she had ignored. I didn't respond immediately. I wasn't ready to explain myself to her just yet. The aftermath of what had just happened needed to settle in. I needed space. The weight of what I had done, of what I was about to do, was suffocating in a way I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about leaving David. It was about leaving behind everything I had known, everything I had been told was supposed to be my life. And while part of me felt a rush of freedom, part of me was also terrified of what the future held. I had barely made it a few blocks when my phone buzzed again. This time it was Richard, David's father. His message came through in all caps, a panic-induced attempt to regain control. "You've made a terrible mistake, Sarah. Think about what you're doing. This will ruin you. This will ruin your life. I read his words and felt a bitter laugh bubble up inside me. Ruin me? Was that really what he thought this was about? No, I realized then. He wasn't worried about me. He was worried about himself. His own reputation, his empire of lies, his carefully curated world where everything remained in the right place. And I had just thrown a grenade into the center of it all. I didn't respond to his message. Instead, I deleted it and focused on the road ahead. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about what was coming next, about the consequences for them. For him. For all of them. When I finally arrived at my apartment, the reality of my new life hit me like a wave. The space was small, modest even, but it was mine. I had furnished it slowly, piece by piece, over the course of the last few months, each item purchased with my own money, each step taken toward my independence. The apartment felt like a sanctuary, a safe haven where I could finally breathe, finally be myself without the looming shadow of David's control. But even here, the fallout was already beginning. My phone buzzed again, and this time, it was Caroline once more. "I had no idea," she wrote, the words coming through with an unexpected sincerity. "I didn't know what was happening. I wish I had said something sooner. I'm sorry, Sarah." I sat down on the couch, reading her message over and over again. It was a small step, but it was something. Caroline wasn't just apologizing for what David had done. She was acknowledging her own complicity in letting it happen, in allowing the cycle to continue without ever questioning it. It was the first real crack in the family's perfect facade, and it made me wonder if maybe there was hope for her, too. Maybe, just maybe, she would learn to break free just like I had. But the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Not by a long shot. I spent the next few hours responding to messages, mostly from Richard's friends and colleagues, all trying to convince me to come to my senses, to return to the family fold and forget everything I had discovered. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I wasn't going to be swayed by their empty promises or their desperate pleas. I had made my choice, and there was no turning back. By the time I finally laid my phone down, the reality of what I had done was setting in. David wasn't going to go quietly. I knew that. He would try to fight me, try to tear me down, to drag me back into his web. But he wouldn't succeed. Not anymore. I had already made arrangements with my lawyer, and the legal battle had begun. My escape plan was in motion. The walls I had spent years building around myself had finally come down, and I was free. But as I sat in my new apartment, surrounded by boxes and empty spaces, I felt something I hadn't expected. A deep, aching sadness. Not for the life I had left behind, but for the years I had wasted, the years I had spent living for someone else, for a family that would never accept me for who I truly was, and for the woman I had almost become, the woman who had been so afraid to stand up, to speak out, to fight back. But that woman was gone, and in her place stood someone stronger, someone who knew that she deserved more, and I would never again settle for less. The phone buzzed again. It was Eleanor, my former mother-in-law. Her message was simple, almost tentative. "I understand," she wrote. "I just filed for divorce today. Richard doesn't know yet. I'm scared, but I'm ready." Tears welled in my eyes as I read her words. Eleanor had spent decades in silence, just like I had. She had lived under the same oppressive system, the same set of expectations, the same suffocating control. And now she was free too. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of everything that had happened, everything that was still to come. The journey was far from over. There would be obstacles, battles to fight, but for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope for myself. And for all the women who would follow in my footsteps, who would learn that it was never too late to break free. As the night stretched on and the city outside my window hummed with life, I felt the beginning of something new. A new chapter. A new life. And I wasn't afraid anymore. I had taken the first step, and there was no turning back. The days following my departure from David were a blur of emotions, uncertainty, and a strange sense of liberation. I spent the first few nights in my new apartment, sitting on the floor, surrounded by boxes, as I tried to wrap my mind around the reality of my situation. The silence was overwhelming at times. No more arguments, no more controlling words, no more walking on eggshells. But with the silence came the space to breathe, to think, to feel the weight of everything I had been holding in for so long. I had broken free, but now I had to rebuild. I had to learn how to reclaim the pieces of myself that I had lost in the years of submission, to take back the control that had been stripped away from me bit by bit. The first step was finding my voice. I had spent so long silencing myself, so long swallowing my feelings and opinions in favor of keeping the peace, that I had forgotten what it felt like to speak without hesitation, without fear of reprisal. It was strange at first, finding the courage to express my thoughts, to speak up in meetings, to tell people what I truly wanted. But it came back to me slowly, piece by piece. Every time I spoke up for myself, every time I set a boundary, I felt a little more powerful. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was living, and I had never felt more alive. I started going back to things I had abandoned years ago. Writing, reading, even small creative projects that I had once loved. I had always been a writer, but David had never understood that part of me. He had belittled it, told me it was a waste of time, something I should give up in favor of more productive pursuits. But now I could write for myself again. I could create without judgment, without the pressure to conform to someone else's vision of who I should be. At work, things started to change too. I had always been competent, always been driven, but I had hidden my ambition, tucked it away under the guise of supporting my husband, playing the role of the dutiful wife. Now I could let that ambition shine. I dove headfirst into my projects, taking on more responsibility, pushing myself in ways I had never dared before. The respect I had once longed for was starting to materialize, not from the outside, but from within. I was becoming the woman I had always wanted to be, the woman who no longer apologized for her strength, for her intelligence, for her drive. I wasn't just reclaiming my power, I was amplifying it. The more I stepped into my true self, the more I realized just how much I had underestimated my own strength. There were moments, of course, when doubt crept in, when the remnants of old fears whispered in my ear. Was I making the right decision? Was I strong enough to take on everything that was coming my way? But those moments were fleeting. Every time I faced a challenge head-on, every time I overcame a hurdle that I once thought insurmountable, I felt more certain in my decision, more confident in the path I was forging. It wasn't just about professional success. It was about reclaiming my worth in every aspect of my life. I started reconnecting with friends, the ones I had let slip away over the years. Women who had been there for me, women who had supported me when I was too afraid to ask for help, women who had never judged me, no matter how small I had made myself in the past. We began to meet for coffee, for dinners, for simple moments of shared laughter and understanding. I realized how much I had lost by isolating myself, by allowing David's control to cut me off from the people who truly cared about me. But now I was rebuilding those relationships, strengthening them, and in the process I was learning to trust myself again. I started to embrace my body in ways I never had before. For years, I had hidden myself under baggy clothes, tried to make myself small, make myself invisible so as not to draw attention. David had always made me feel like I wasn't enough. Too loud, too confident, too independent. But now, in the quiet of my own home, I began to rediscover the power of my own body. I went for walks in the park, started doing yoga, letting my body move and stretch in ways it had been denied for so long. I felt stronger, more in tune with myself than I had ever been. It wasn't just about physical strength, it was about the strength of finally accepting who I was, without apologies. The first time I spoke at a women's support group, I was nervous, unsure of what I would say, unsure if my story was worth sharing. But as I started to speak, I realized how much power there was in my story. My voice, once so small, was resonating with others, and in that moment, I felt the weight of my journey lift from my shoulders. The woman I had been was no longer a victim. She was a warrior. And that warrior had something to offer, something valuable. My words mattered. My experiences mattered. And they could help others who were walking the same path I had once walked. There were still difficult days ahead, moments when I missed the comfort of the life I had known, the ease of submission, the certainty of playing a role. But those days were fewer and farther between. The woman I had become didn't need that comfort anymore. She didn't need anyone to validate her existence. She had learned to trust herself, to trust the choices she made, and to find peace in the knowledge that she was in control of her own destiny. I took another step forward each day. Whether it was standing a little taller in a meeting, making a decision that was all mine, or simply breathing without fear, I knew that I was reclaiming not just my power, but my life. I was finally the person I had always been underneath all the layers of fear and doubt. And I would never again let anyone take that from me. In the months that followed, the world around me began to change. People started noticing the shift in me, the new energy I was bringing into every room. The compliments rolled in, but they weren't the shallow kind I had once craved. They were deeper, more meaningful. "You seem different," my colleagues would say. "You look so confident." And I knew then that the changes weren't just visible, they were real. I had become a woman who knew her worth, who had fought for it, who had claimed it with every ounce of strength she had. And as I stood on the precipice of my new life, looking ahead at all the possibilities, I knew one thing for certain. I would never again allow anyone to make me feel small. The power that had been within me all along had finally been set free, and there was no turning back. As the weeks went by, it became clear that the ripples of my departure were not just affecting me. They were reaching David, his family, and the carefully constructed life he had built for himself. It didn't take long for the cracks in his facade to widen, the illusion of control he had maintained for so long starting to crumble. For years, he had held the reins, convinced that his wealth, his status, his dominance were enough to keep me in line, to keep everyone in line. But now, with the evidence I had carefully gathered, the tables were turning, and it wasn't long before David began to feel the weight of everything I had set in motion. At first, it was subtle. Small signs that he was no longer in control. The phone calls to his lawyer that went unanswered, the hastily arranged meetings with his business associates who were suddenly far less eager to work with him. His once immaculate reputation, the one he had worked so hard to perfect, began to fray at the edges. People started talking, his colleagues, his clients, even his friends. They had always admired him for his success, his ability to bend situations to his will, but now they were beginning to ask questions. Questions he couldn't answer. The news about the financial discrepancies, the fraudulent transactions I had uncovered, spread like wildfire. His law firm, once so proud to represent him, began to distance themselves, citing concerns about his ethical practices. It didn't take long before they suspended him, pending an internal investigation. His father's business partners followed suit, launching their own inquiries into the shady dealings I had exposed. What had once been a carefully controlled empire was quickly unraveling, and David was powerless to stop it. But even as he spiraled, I found myself rising. What had once felt like the beginning of my downfall had turned into the catalyst for my success. With David's empire crumbling around him, the doors I had been waiting for slowly began to open. My career, which I had put on hold for so long to support his, suddenly took center stage. The projects I had quietly worked on, the ideas I had kept to myself for years, were now being noticed. My colleagues began to see me for who I truly was, not just the supportive wife, but the intelligent, capable woman who had been buried under the weight of someone else's expectations. It wasn't just in my career where I began to thrive. I started speaking at conferences, at workshops, sharing my story and the lessons I had learned. At first, it felt like I was standing on shaky ground, unsure if anyone would listen, unsure if my voice mattered. But the more I spoke, the more I realized how much power there was in my story. I wasn't just telling people what had happened to me. I was teaching them how to break free from the same cycle, how to recognize the signs of control, of abuse, before it was too late. I was showing them that it was possible to walk away, to reclaim your life, to take back your power. Meanwhile, David's descent into chaos continued. The financial documents I had submitted to the authorities began to make their way through the system, and it wasn't long before the IRS came knocking. The tax evasion schemes, the illegal transfers, everything was laid bare for the world to see. The family he had built his empire on began to turn on him, as they realized the depth of his deceit. Richard, who had once been so confident in his son's abilities, now found himself caught up in the web of lies, his own reputation tarnished by association. And then came the final blow. David, in his desperation to salvage whatever was left of his crumbling world, made one last attempt to reach out to me. He showed up at my office, uninvited, his clothes disheveled, his face lined with stress and fear. It was the first time I had seen him so vulnerable, so small. For years, he had been the man who controlled everything, who manipulated every situation to his advantage. But now, he was a shell of that man, desperate for redemption, desperate for a chance to reclaim even a fraction of his former power. "Sarah," he began, his voice shaky. "I've changed. I'm going to therapy, anger management. I've realized how wrong I was. Please just give me one more chance. I'll make it right." I sat across from him, staring at the man who had once been my husband, the man who had broken me, who had tried to control me in every way possible. And in that moment, I realized just how far I had come. I had spent years believing that I needed him, that my worth was tied to his approval. But here he was, begging me for forgiveness, and I saw him for what he truly was. Someone who had never truly cared for me, someone who had used me to prop up his own fragile ego. I looked him in the eyes, and for the first time in my life I didn't flinch. I didn't hesitate. "I believe you've changed," I said calmly. "But I've changed too. And this version of me deserves more than an improved version of you." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with the weight of everything unspoken. David opened his mouth as if to argue, but the words never came. Instead, he sat there, defeated, realizing that he had lost. Not just me, but the life he had built on lies. His empire was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As security escorted him out of the building, I felt a strange sense of closure wash over me. This wasn't just about him. It was about me, about the woman I had become. I had faced him, stood up to him, and walked away without looking back. I was free, and with that freedom came success. My career flourished. My voice grew louder, more confident, and soon, my expertise in financial abuse became sought after. I began consulting, speaking at events, writing articles, and before long, my book on financial independence for women was published. It became a bestseller. As David's world continued to fall apart, mine was just beginning to rise. The professional respect I had once longed for was finally mine. My new life, built on my own terms, was just beginning, and I was taking control of it in a way I had never done before. While David struggled to pick up the pieces of a life he had shattered, I stood tall, knowing that the power I had reclaimed was not just mine to keep. It was mine to share. I was part of something bigger now. I was part of a movement that was teaching others to break free, to stand up, to take control of their own destinies. And as I looked out over the city from my office window, I couldn't help but smile. This wasn't just my success. It was a victory for all of us who had been silenced, who had been held down, who had been told we weren't enough. We were all rising, and there was nothing at all that could stop us now. The changes in my life were no longer confined to the four walls of my apartment or the walls of my office. They began to ripple outward, touching more lives than I had ever anticipated. I had started this journey for myself, but somewhere along the way, I realized that my story wasn't just mine to keep. It was something bigger. It was something that could ignite change in others, something that could offer hope to those who had been quietly suffering, just as I had. It started with the women who reached out to me. Emails, messages, phone calls, all from women who had heard my story, who had read my articles or attended my talks. They were strangers to me, but they shared something important. They shared their pain, their struggles, their own battles with control, with manipulation, with emotional and financial abuse. And with every message, I felt the weight of my own experience shift. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the collective. It was about showing others that there was a way out. I began receiving invitations to speak at conferences, at local women's shelters, at community centers. Every time I spoke, I found myself growing stronger, more certain of my purpose. I wasn't just telling my story for the sake of healing. I was telling it to teach others how to break free. I was teaching them how to spot the signs of abuse before it consumed them, how to trust their instincts and reclaim the power that had been stripped away. One of the most memorable moments came when I was invited to speak at a women's retreat, a gathering of women from all walks of life, each one with her own story of struggle and resilience. I had been asked to lead a session on financial independence, on how to manage money and break free from the constraints of financial control. The room was filled with women of all ages, from young professionals to older women who had spent their entire lives in marriages that had stripped them of their autonomy. As I stood before them, I felt a shift in the room. These weren't just women listening to a speaker. They were women who were hungry for change, hungry for a way out. Their eyes were wide, their hands raised with questions, with stories of their own. And for the first time, I realized how powerful this moment was. I wasn't just speaking to them, I was speaking with them. Together, we were taking the first steps toward a new way of thinking, a new way of living, a new way of being. The more I shared, the more I realized how much of my journey resonated with them. They had all felt the same sense of powerlessness, the same crushing weight of manipulation and control. And as I told them how I had documented everything, how I had planned my escape carefully, step by step, I could see the spark of hope in their eyes. They realized that they, too, could take control. They, too, could reclaim their lives. As I spoke, I remembered how alone I had once felt, how trapped I had been in a marriage that had suffocated me, in a family that had enabled his behavior, in a life that had felt like a cage. But in that room, surrounded by these women, I didn't feel alone anymore. I felt like part of something bigger, something powerful. I felt the ripple of change beginning, not just in my own life, but in theirs too. Soon after, I started receiving requests from women's shelters, asking if I would work with their clients, helping them recognize the signs of financial and emotional abuse, teaching them how to protect themselves, how to plan an escape if needed. I agreed, of course, because I knew how important it was to have that knowledge, to have that power. And I was amazed at how many women came forward, eager to learn, eager to take back what had been taken from them. One of the most surprising and rewarding aspects of this was hearing from women who had been in the audience of my talks, or who had read my articles and had decided to take action. Some had left their marriages, some had secured their financial independence, and some had simply started to stand up for themselves in ways they never had before. One woman, in particular, reached out to me months after a seminar I had hosted. She told me that after hearing my story, she had realized that she deserved more, that she didn't need to be trapped in a relationship that was slowly destroying her. She had left her husband, opened her own bank account, and started a new job. And she thanked me for giving her the courage to take that first step. It was moments like these that made everything worth it. It wasn't just about my personal victory. It was about creating a wave of change that rippled out, one woman at a time, until the impact was felt across entire communities. I began to see how this ripple effect had the potential to grow into a movement that could not only help women break free from their own abusive situations, but also challenge the very structures that allowed this abuse to flourish in the first place. As my work continued, I found myself connecting with other advocates, other survivors who had turned their pain into power. We shared ideas, resources, strategies for reaching more people, for creating a broader platform for change. The movement was growing, and with it, my own sense of purpose deepened. I wasn't just helping individuals anymore. I was part of something much larger than myself. And all the while, David's world continued to implode. The more I succeeded, the more his downfall seemed inevitable. The legal proceedings against him were moving forward, and with each passing day, the walls he had so carefully constructed around himself crumbled a little more. His business partners had cut ties, his clients were backing out, and the legal system was closing in on the fraudulent activities he had orchestrated for years. His once thriving law firm dropped him. His reputation, built on deceit and manipulation, was now a shadow of what it once was. I watched as his world fell apart, but it wasn't out of malice. It was out of something far more important, justice. He had spent so many years hurting others, believing that he could control their lives, their futures. But the ripple effect of his actions had finally caught up with him. And while his fall from grace was inevitable, I knew that my rise was just as certain. I was no longer defined by what I had endured. I was defined by what I had chosen to do with that pain. I had chosen to rise, to fight, to stand strong. And as I watched the ripple effect spread, across cities, across states, across the lives of women I had never met, I knew that this was just the beginning. The power was not in the revenge. It was in the transformation. The power was in becoming the woman I was always meant to be. And now I was helping others do the same. The journey had come full circle, and as I stood at the podium, staring out at the sea of faces in the crowd, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I had come. It had been a long road, one filled with pain, doubt, and struggle, but it had also been a road to self-discovery, empowerment, and triumph. The woman who once sat quietly in the corner, hidden behind her husband's shadow, had been replaced by someone unrecognizable. A woman who had fought for her freedom, reclaimed her power, and now stood before a room full of people, sharing her story to inspire change. I had been invited to speak at a major conference on financial independence and empowerment for women, a platform where my voice could be heard, where my story could reach thousands. The crowd was diverse, some women in business suits, others from the nonprofit sector, and a few younger women who were just beginning to navigate their careers. They were all here because they had one thing in common. They were ready to take control of their futures. And as I began to speak, I knew that my words were no longer just mine. They belonged to every woman who had ever been told she wasn't enough, every woman who had been silenced, every woman who had been made to feel small. 5 years ago, I was a woman who couldn't see beyond the walls of her own life. I began, my voice steady but full of emotion. I was a woman trapped in a marriage that suffocated me, a woman who thought she wasn't strong enough to break free. But I was wrong. I wasn't weak. I was just waiting for the right moment to realize the strength I had inside me. I paused for a moment, letting my words sink in. The room was quiet, every person hanging on to every syllable. I could feel their energy, their connection to my story, and it made me realize just how important this moment was. Not just for me, but for all of us. It wasn't just about leaving a man, I continued, my eyes scanning the room, meeting the gaze of several women who nodded along with me. It was about leaving behind everything I thought I was supposed to be and becoming the woman I always had the potential to be. It was about breaking free from the expectations, the control, the manipulation that had been placed on me. It was about reclaiming my life. The applause that followed was louder than I expected, and for a moment, I stood there in awe, but I quickly regained my composure, knowing that this wasn't just about applause. It was about the impact these words would have on the women sitting in that room. It was about the ripple effect, the change that was being sparked by this shared moment of truth. After my speech, I was approached by countless women. Some shared their own stories. Some thanked me for giving them the courage to stand up for themselves, and some simply hugged me, as if to say, "You are not alone." Their words filled me with a deep sense of fulfillment, but more than that, they filled me with a sense of purpose. I realized that this was my new life, one where my experiences, my struggles, my triumphs were not just for me, but for everyone who needed to hear them. It was about creating a space where women could rise together, where we could all support one another, lift each other up, and change the world around us. As I left the conference hall, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. One I hadn't even realized was there. The past had been heavy, but the future felt light. It was filled with possibilities, with new beginnings, with opportunities one hadn't allowed myself to consider before. And for the first time, I felt completely in control of my life. In the months that followed, everything shifted. My career took off in ways I hadn't imagined possible. I was invited to collaborate with organizations that focused on women's rights, financial literacy, and emotional independence. My book, Breaking Free, Reclaiming Your Life from Financial Control, became a bestseller, and I began speaking at events around the country, inspiring women to take control of their financial futures and break free from the cycle of abuse and manipulation. But it wasn't just the professional success that changed, it was me. I had rebuilt my identity from the ground up, but this time it was mine. I no longer had to hide who I was, to shrink myself to make space for others. I had stopped apologizing for my success, for my ambition, for my strength. And every day, I grew more confident in my ability to navigate the world on my own terms. One day, while I was sitting in my new office, looking out over the city skyline, I received a message from Caroline, the woman who had once been a silent bystander in her brother's abusive world, the one who had quietly watched as I was controlled and manipulated, was reaching out to me for the first time in years. "I've left him," the message read. "It's over. I'm scared, but I'm free. I don't know how to thank you for showing me it was possible." Tears welled up in my eyes as I read her words. It wasn't just that she had left David. She had left a life of silence, of fear, of complacency. She had finally found the strength to break free, just like I had. It was a victory for her, but also for me. I had shown her the way, not through words alone, but through action. And in that moment, I knew that all the pain, all the sacrifice, all the struggle had been worth it. The ripple effect had begun, and it was growing, spreading, touching lives in ways I had never imagined. Every woman who found her voice, every woman who stood up and took control, was part of this movement. And together we were changing the world. As I walked out of my office that day, a sense of peace settled over me. The woman who had once been a shadow of herself, the woman who had lived in fear and doubt, was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew her worth, who had fought for her freedom, and who was determined to create a world where other women could do the same. And as I looked ahead, I saw not just the bright future waiting for me, but the endless possibilities for all the women who were finally learning to rise. The circle had come full, and the story had only just begun.